The glass didn't just reflect her face. It reflected the woman he once decided wasn't enough. The building rose 47 stories into the Chicago skyline, its mirrored surface catching the late afternoon sun like a blade of light. And Amara Brooks stood still on the sidewalk across the street, her heels planted firm against the concrete, as if the ground itself had finally decided to hold her up. 5 years ago, she wouldn't have lasted 5 seconds under this kind of pressure. Not with the way her chest used to tighten in rooms that smelled like money and decisions. Not with the way her voice used to soften when she felt small. But now there was no tremor in her breathing, no hesitation in the way her shoulders settled back, no flicker of doubt in her eyes as she watched the revolving doors spin open and closed, swallowing executives in tailored suits and polished confidence. The kind of people who used to look straight through her like she didn't belong in their world. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal coat, the fabric smooth and deliberate under her fingers, and for a moment the reflection shifted, her present self overlaying the ghost of who she used to be. And the memory came back sharp, not loud, not chaotic, just precise, like a line that had been etched into glass and never quite erased. You don't fit the life I'm building. Ethan Caldwell hadn't raised his voice when he said it, hadn't needed to. The room had already done the work for him. The soft hum of the city below, the skyline stretching beyond the penthouse windows, the quiet clink of ice in a crystal glass on the table between them. It had all framed his words like they belonged there, like they were inevitable, like she should have seen them coming long before he ever spoke them out loud. Amara remembered the way the light had hit the side of his face that night, cool and controlled, how he didn't look angry or cruel, just certain. And that certainty had cut deeper than anything louder ever could have. She had stood there, hands still, spine straight, listening as he explained it in terms that sounded almost reasonable, almost kind if you didn't look too closely. His company expanding, his public image evolving. The expectations that came with being the face of a billion-dollar empire, and somewhere inside all of that, there was no space left for the woman who had stood beside him before any of it existed. No space for the girl who had taken late-night calls with him when deals were falling apart, who had believed in something before it had numbers attached to it, before it had headlines, before it had him speaking in a tone that sounded like a press release instead of a person. She hadn't argued, hadn't asked him to reconsider, hadn't reminded him of anything they had built together. Because she understood something in that moment that he didn't. When someone decides your worth based on the version of themselves they're trying to become, there is nothing you can say that will make them see you clearly again. So she had nodded once, a small movement, barely noticeable, and reached for the only thing on the table that still belonged to her, a thin folder with her notes, her plans, her ideas, things he had skimmed past without really reading. And she had taken it with her when she walked out, the door closing behind her with a quiet click that no one in that building would remember but her. Outside, the city had felt colder than it should have for early fall, the wind cutting through the streets in sharp lines, and she had stood there for a second longer than she needed to, just long enough to let the reality settle into her bones, not as pain, not as humiliation, but as something cleaner, something sharper, a decision. She disappeared after that, not in the dramatic way people imagine, no packed bags thrown into a car in the middle of the night, no tearful goodbyes. No messages left unread, just a series of quiet choices that pulled her further and further away from everything that had once defined her. She changed apartments, changed jobs, changed the rhythm of her days until even the city itself stopped recognizing her patterns. And in that silence, in that space where no one was watching and no one was expecting anything from her, she started to build something that didn't need his approval to exist. The first year was the hardest, not because of him, but because of the absence of everything she had relied on, the stability, the connections, the illusion that someone else's world could carry her weight. And there were nights when the numbers didn't add up, when the rent was due and the freelance contracts hadn't come through yet, when the coffee went cold on her desk at 2 a.m. while she reworked proposals that no one had asked for yet. But she kept going, not with desperation, but with a kind of quiet discipline that didn't need motivation to survive. She learned the market from the inside out, not from boardrooms but from the edges, from the overlooked data sets and the patterns that executives dismissed because they didn't fit their narratives. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Her work started to circulate, her name appearing in conversations she wasn't in, her analysis getting forwarded, referenced, requested, until one day it wasn't just a side note anymore. It was a factor, something people paid attention to whether they wanted to or not. Years passed like that, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady, deliberate steps, each one building on the last, until the version of her that had once stood in that penthouse felt like a distant memory, not erased, but integrated, a foundation rather than a limitation. Now, standing across from the same building where it had all ended, she could feel the full weight of that journey, not as a burden, but as proof, something solid and undeniable that didn't need to be announced because it was already evident in the way she carried herself, in the way the city seemed to move around her instead of over her, in the way her name had become something people recognized before they even saw her face. A black car pulled up to the curb in front of the entrance, its door opening smoothly as a driver stepped out, but she didn't move toward it immediately, didn't rush to step into the next moment, because she understood something now that she hadn't back then. Timing wasn't about urgency, it was about control. She took one last look at the reflection in the glass, at the woman who no longer needed validation from the man who once defined her place in his life, and then she stepped forward, crossing the street with measured steps, the sound of her heels steady against the pavement, each one landing with quiet certainty as the doors ahead of her opened, not because she forced them to, but because this time, she belonged on the other side. The lobby did not welcome people, it assessed them, and as the glass doors sealed shut behind her, the sound of the city dissolved into a controlled silence that carried the faint hum of climate systems and the soft echo of footsteps across polished marble, the kind of environment designed to remind everyone who walked through it that they were entering a space where decisions were made at a level most would never reach. But Amara Brooks did not slow down, did not glance around like someone measuring her place. She moved forward with a steady rhythm, her reflection trailing alongside her in the mirrored columns, each step aligned with the version of herself she had built in the years no one was watching. And when the receptionist looked up, there was a flicker of recognition, not from memory, but from expectation, the kind reserved for people whose names had already arrived before they did. And Amara gave a small nod. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, just enough to acknowledge the exchange before continuing toward the elevators that rose like vertical lines of steel and light against the far wall. The elevator doors opened before she reached them, as if anticipating her arrival, and inside, the space was quiet, enclosed, the walls reflecting her from every angle, multiplying her presence into something larger than a single figure. And for a brief moment, as the door slid shut and the car began its ascent, she allowed herself to breathe deeper, not out of nerves, but out of awareness, because this was not just another meeting. This was the intersection of everything she had been and everything she had become, and she understood the weight of that without letting it control her. The numbers above the door climbed steadily, each floor passing with a soft chime that marked distance not just in height, but in time, 5 years condensed into seconds, and with each rise, the memory of the last time she had been in this building surfaced again, not as something that pulled her back, but as something that confirmed how far she had come. And when the elevator reached the executive level, the doors opened to a corridor lined with glass offices and muted tones, a space where conversations were held in measured voices, and every movement carried intention. A man in a tailored navy suit approached from the far end, his pace confident but not rushed, and when he reached her, he extended his hand with a practiced professionalism that stopped just short of being overly familiar. "Ms. Brooks, we have been expecting you," he said, his tone even, his posture respectful, and she shook his hand firmly, her grip steady, her gaze level. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, carrying just enough warmth to remain human without losing authority, and he gestured toward the conference room ahead, its glass walls revealing a long table surrounded by empty chairs, screens already lit with projections of numbers, charts, and projections that defined the future of companies like the one Ethan Caldwell had built. Inside the room, everything was set, water glasses placed precisely, folders aligned, the environment curated for efficiency, but there was an undercurrent in the air, something unspoken, something waiting. And Amara stepped to the head of the table without hesitation, setting her portfolio down with a quiet precision before taking her seat, not as someone claiming space, but as someone who had already earned it long before she walked in. Outside the glass walls, movement continued, assistants passing by, conversations happening in low tones. But inside, there was stillness, a pause before the moment shifted, and she allowed her fingers to rest lightly on the table, grounding herself in the present, not the past, not the memory of a night that had once defined her, but the reality of what she had built since then. Minutes passed, measured, intentional, and then the door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal the arrival of someone accustomed to entering rooms without needing to announce it. And Ethan Caldwell stepped in, his presence filling the space in a way that had once felt overwhelming, his suit tailored to perfection, his expression composed, his posture carrying the same controlled confidence that had made him successful. But as his eyes lifted and met hers, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of pause that cannot be hidden no matter how practiced the exterior might be. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to fold in on itself, the past and present aligning in a way that left no room for interpretation, and she saw it in his eyes, not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition layered with something deeper, something he had not prepared for, because the version of her sitting at the head of that table did not match the memory he had filed away years ago. And for the first time since he had walked into a room expecting control, he hesitated, just enough to break the rhythm he had built his life on. Amara did not stand, did not move to close the distance. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, not as a challenge, not as a statement, but as an acknowledgement of reality. And then she shifted her attention to the documents in front of her. The gesture small but decisive, resetting the dynamic without a single word. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the room with clarity and precision. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you for joining us," she said, the formality deliberate, the distance intentional, and he nodded once, stepping forward, taking his seat along the side of the table rather than at its head, a detail that did not go unnoticed by anyone present, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. The meeting began, as all meetings do, with numbers, projections, discussions framed in terms of growth and opportunity. But beneath it all, there was a tension that had nothing to do with business, something that existed between them, unspoken, unresolved, and yet fully understood. And as Amara guided the conversation, her tone steady, her questions precise, her control over the room absolute, Ethan listened, not just to the content, but to the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way she no longer needed anything from him. And with each passing minute, the realization settled deeper, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, undeniable truth, that the woman he had once dismissed as incompatible with his future was now the one defining the terms of it. The screens shifted, data aligning with her analysis, her strategy unfolding in a way that left little room for objection. And when she paused, allowing space for input, the room remained quiet for a second longer than expected, not out of confusion, but out of recognition of her authority. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Your projections assume a level of restructuring that would require significant adjustment," he said, his words careful, his tone neutral, but beneath it, there was something else, something that had nothing to do with the numbers on the screen. And Amara looked at him, not as someone revisiting the past, but as someone evaluating the present. "They do," she replied, her voice even. "And they are based on data that has been consistently overlooked in your current model." And she gestured to the screen, the numbers shifting to support her point, the evidence clear, structured, undeniable. The conversation continued, but the balance had already shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed out in a single moment, but in a series of subtle changes that redefined the space they were in. And as the meeting moved forward, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was no longer just a negotiation. It was a recalibration of power, one that did not need to be announced because it was already visible in the way Ethan listened, in the way he adjusted, in the way he no longer controlled the direction of the conversation. When the meeting concluded, The room exhaled. Chairs shifting, papers being gathered, conversations resuming at a lower volume. But Amara remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady, not on him, but on the space in front of her, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided long before this moment. And when she finally stood, the movement was smooth, deliberate, and without hesitation. And as she walked toward the door, passing him without pause, without a glance back, the distance between them felt different, not wider, not narrower, just defined. And for the first time, Ethan understood that whatever existed between them now was no longer something he could shape, only something he would have to face. The hallway outside the conference room carried a different kind of silence, one that followed decisions rather than waited for them. And as the glass door eased shut behind her, the faint echo of conversation resumed inside without her, a reminder that the room would continue to function whether she stayed or left, but the outcome of what had just happened would not move forward without her influence. And Amara Brooks walked down the corridor with the same steady pace she had entered with, her heels striking the floor in a rhythm that did not rush and did not hesitate, each step measured, each movement aligned with the control she had established, and the reflections in the glass offices mirrored her passing figure like a sequence of frames, each one capturing a version of her that no longer needed to look back to confirm her direction. At the far end, the city stretched beyond the windows in a wide expanse of steel and light, Lake Michigan catching the late sun in long silver lines that cut across the horizon, and for a moment, she slowed, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness. Because moments like this were not about what came next, they were about recognizing what had already shifted, and she rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the glass, feeling the steadiness of something solid beneath her fingertips, something that did not bend, did not question, did not ask her to prove herself again. Behind her, the door opened, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough to change the air, and she heard the familiar cadence of footsteps, approaching, controlled but slightly out of rhythm, as if the person carrying them was adjusting to something new. And she did not turn immediately, did not offer him the reaction he might have expected years ago. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough to define the distance between them before acknowledging it. Amara. Ethan Caldwell's voice carried across the space, lower than it had been in the meeting, less structured, less contained, and she turned then, slowly, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, meeting his gaze without tension, without softness, simply present. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to recognize the boundary that now existed between them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood that whatever came next would not be framed by the past the way it once had been. "I did not know you were leading this," he said finally, his tone measured, but lacking the certainty it once carried. And she held his gaze, considering his words not as an apology, not as an excuse, but as information, something to be acknowledged without being absorbed. "You were not supposed to," she replied, her voice even, her words simple, and the clarity of that answer settled between them with a weight that did not need emphasis. Ethan exhaled slightly, the movement subtle, but visible, as if adjusting to the reality that he was no longer the one directing the conversation, and his eyes searched her face, not for familiarity, but for understanding, for something that could bridge the gap between what he remembered and what stood in front of him now. "You built all of this," he said, his voice quieter, not questioning, but confirming, and Amara glanced briefly toward the city beyond the glass, the skyline, that had once felt out of reach now forming the backdrop of her present. "I built what I needed," she answered, and there was no pride in her tone, no need to emphasize the effort it had taken, just a statement of fact, grounded and complete. The silence that followed was different from the one in the conference room, this one not filled with observation or evaluation, but with something more personal, something that did not belong to the structures they operated within. And Ethan shifted slightly, his hands resting at his sides instead of in his pockets, a small change, but one that spoke to a lack of the ease he once carried so effortlessly. "I meant what I said back then," he continued, the words deliberate, not defensive, but not apologetic either, as if he was trying to place the past in a context that made sense to him now. And Amara did not interrupt, did not challenge him. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, giving him the space to complete the thought without granting it more significance than it deserved. I was building something that required focus, alignment, and I made decisions based on that, he added. And there was a pause, a moment where the explanation hung in the air, waiting to see if it would be accepted, rejected, or ignored. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of understanding. And now, she asked, her tone neutral, not inviting, not pushing, just opening a space for him to continue if he chose to. And Ethan hesitated, just for a second, as if the question had reached a place he had not fully prepared to answer. Now I see that I was building something incomplete, he said finally, the words measured, careful, and for the first time since he had approached her, there was a shift in his voice that did not align with control, something closer to recognition, to realization. And Amara watched him for a moment longer, not searching for sincerity, not evaluating his intent, simply observing the difference between who he had been and who he was attempting to be now. What you built still stands, she replied, her voice steady. It just does not include me. And the simplicity of that statement removed any ambiguity, any possibility of rewriting the past into something more convenient. And Ethan looked at her, the weight of that clarity settling in a way that could not be negotiated. It should have, he said, the words quieter now, not as a declaration, but as an admission. And for a moment, the version of him that had once spoken in absolutes seemed to step aside, revealing something less certain, less controlled. Amara did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to hold the space between his words and her own. And when she spoke, her tone remained unchanged, calm, grounded. You made the decision that fit your life at the time, she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, no lingering resentment, just a clear acknowledgement of reality. And I made mine. And with that, the balance shifted again, not back to where it had been, but forward, into something that neither of them had fully defined yet. Ethan nodded slowly, as if processing not just her words, but the absence of what he might have expected from her. No anger, no attempt to revisit what had been lost, no demand for explanation beyond what had already been said. And that absence carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it left him with nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to fix. Only the understanding that the space he had created between them had been filled by something he was not part of. The elevator at the end of the corridor chimed softly, its doors opening to an empty car waiting to descend, and Amara glanced toward it briefly, the next step, already clear in her mind, not because she was leaving something behind, but because she was continuing forward. And when she looked back at him, there was no hesitation, no lingering question in her expression, just the same composed presence she had carried since she walked into the building. We will move forward with the terms discussed, she said, returning the focus to what mattered now, the present, the work, the decisions that would shape what came next. And Ethan nodded, the professional acknowledgement coming naturally even as something deeper remained unresolved. Understood, he replied, his voice steady again, but changed in a way that could not be reversed. And as she turned and walked toward the elevator, her steps measured, her posture unwavering, he remained where he was, watching not as someone in control, but as someone who had just realized that the most important thing he had lost was not a deal, not a position, but a version of the future he could no longer access. And when the elevator doors closed around her, the reflection in the metal surface captured her one last time, not as a memory, but as proof that she had never needed to return to him to become who she was meant to be. The elevator descended in silence, a smooth, controlled drop that mirrored the steadiness in her breathing, and Amara Brooks stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, her reflection stretched across the brushed steel walls in long, clean lines, not distorted, not fragmented, just multiplied into angles that confirmed what she already knew, that she had stepped into a space she no longer had to earn piece by piece because she had already built the version of herself that belonged there. And as the numbers above the door counted down floor by floor, she did not replay the conversation, did not dissect Ethan's words or search for meaning behind his tone. because the past had already done its work and the present did not require her to carry it forward. When the doors opened into the lobby again, the light had shifted, the late afternoon sun now lower, casting longer shadows across the marble floor. And the energy of the space had subtly changed, not louder, not busier, but aware in a way that could not be named, as if the building itself had registered something that had just taken place above and was still adjusting to it. She walked toward the exit without pause, her pace steady, her posture composed, and as the doors opened for her once more, the air outside met her with a cool edge that carried the distant hum of traffic and the layered rhythm of the city moving through its evening transition, and for a moment, she stopped just beyond the threshold, not to hesitate, but to absorb the shift from one environment to another, from controlled interiors to open space, from calculated conversations to the unpredictability of the world beyond glass walls. Across the street, the reflection of the building stretched toward her again, but this time she did not study it, did not measure herself against it, because the reflection no longer held authority over her perception. It was just glass, just surface, just something that showed what already existed rather than defining it. And she reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against a thin, folded envelope that had traveled with her longer than anything else from that part of her life, its edges softened by time, its weight familiar without being heavy, and for a second, she considered it, not as a reminder, but as a marker, a point she had once stood at and moved beyond without needing to erase it. A car pulled up along the curb, its door opening as the driver stepped out, offering a quiet nod of recognition, and she moved toward it, her steps measured, her gaze forward, not because she was avoiding anything behind her, but because her direction no longer depended on what she left behind. And as she settled into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound, the city began to move again around her. Buildings passing in a blur of glass and steel, lights flickering on one by one as the day shifted into evening, and she leaned back slightly, allowing herself a moment of stillness that was not about rest, but about clarity. Across town, in a high-rise office that overlooked the same skyline from a different angle, Ethan Caldwell stood alone near his window, the meeting long over, the room cleared, the screens dark, but the sense of disruption lingering in a way that did not align with anything measurable. And he rested his hand against the glass, the cool surface grounding him as he stared out at the city he had spent years shaping through decisions, acquisitions, strategies that had always felt precise and controlled. And yet there was something about the day that refused to fit into that framework, something that had shifted beyond his ability to categorize or contain. His reflection stared back at him, sharp, composed, the same image that had appeared in magazines and reports, the same presence that had commanded rooms and negotiations, but now it carried something else, something subtle but undeniable, a fracture not in confidence, but in certainty, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, but heavier than usual, as if he was recalibrating in real time, adjusting to a version of reality that had not been part of his projections. He turned from the window and walked back toward his desk, the familiar layout offering structure, the files, the reports, the data points that had always anchored his decisions. And he reached for a folder, flipping it open with practiced efficiency, scanning numbers, projections, but the information did not settle the way it normally did not align into the clean patterns he relied on, because beneath it all, there was a recognition that could not be quantified, that the woman who had just sat across from him was not a variable he could adjust for, not a factor he could control or integrate into his model. She was an outcome he had not accounted for, one that existed independently of his influence. His phone vibrated lightly against the desk, a message from his executive team summarizing the meeting, outlining next steps, and he read it quickly, the language precise, the conclusions clear, but even as he processed the information, his mind returned to the moment in the hallway, to the way she had stood, the way she had spoken, the absence of anything that tied her back to him. And for the first time in years, he found himself not analyzing a situation, but feeling the weight of it without a framework to reduce it into something manageable. Across the city, the car slowed as it approached a quieter street lined with trees that softened the edges of the buildings around them. The lights here warmer, the pace slower, and Amara watched as the environment shifted again. from the intensity of downtown to something more grounded, more personal. And when the car came to a stop, she stepped out into the evening air, the sound of distant traffic fading behind the rustle of leaves and the low murmur of a neighborhood settling into night. And she walked toward the building ahead, not grand, not imposing, but intentional in its simplicity, a place that reflected a different kind of success, one not measured in scale, but in stability. Inside, the space was quiet, the lighting soft, the atmosphere carrying a sense of presence rather than performance, and she moved through it with the same ease she had carried all day, her steps familiar, her movements unforced, and as she reached the far room, she paused for just a second before opening the door, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Because some spaces did not require control, they required awareness. Inside, a small figure sat at a table near the window, a child no more than 4 or 5 years old, focused on a set of blocks arranged with careful concentration. And when the door opened, the child looked up, eyes bright, expression open in a way that had not yet learned to measure or calculate, and a smile spread across his face with immediate recognition. "You are back," he said, his voice clear, unfiltered, and Amara stepped inside, her posture softening in a way that did not diminish her strength, but revealed a different layer of it, something quieter, something deeper, and she knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder, grounding both of them in the same moment. "I am," she replied, her voice steady, warm, carrying a softness that did not exist anywhere else in her world, and the child reached for her hand without hesitation, his small fingers wrapping around hers with complete trust. And for a moment, everything else faded, the building, the meeting, the conversation in the hallway, all of it reduced to background noise against the clarity of what mattered here. And as she sat with him, guiding his hand to place another block on top of the structure he was building, she did not think about the past, did not revisit what had been lost or what had changed, because the proof of everything she had become was already here, not in a boardroom, not in a contract, but in the quiet certainty of a life she had built on her own terms, one that did not need to be explained, only lived. The small room held a kind of quiet that did not need to be protected. It existed naturally, carried in the soft glow of the lamp by the window and the faint hum of evening settling into the neighborhood. And Amara Brooks sat on the floor beside the low table, her posture relaxed in a way that did not exist anywhere else in her life, her coat set aside, her sleeves slightly rolled, as if she had stepped out of the world that demanded precision and into one that required presence, and the child beside her focused intently on the tower of blocks rising between them, each piece placed with careful attention, his brows slightly furrowed in concentration as if the small structure carried more weight than it actually did. "It has to be straight," he said, his voice quiet but certain, and she watched him for a moment, the way his hands hovered before placing the next block, measuring balance without knowing the word for it yet, and she nodded softly. "Then we make sure the base is strong," she replied, guiding his hand just enough to steady the piece without taking control, and he smiled slightly as the tower held, his confidence growing with each successful step. And in that simple exchange, there was something that did not need to be explained, something that existed beyond the complexity of contracts and negotiations, something that grounded her in a way nothing else could. The evening stretched around them in quiet layers, the distant sound of a car passing outside, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the soft tap of blocks meeting each other in careful rhythm. And for a while, time moved differently, not measured in outcomes or decisions, but in moments that did not demand anything beyond attention, and Amara allowed herself to stay there fully, not dividing her thoughts, not preparing for what came next, just present in the space she had built piece by piece without needing permission from anyone else. Across the city, in a space that was designed to reflect control and precision, Ethan Caldwell remained at his desk longer than usual. The lights dimmed slightly as the building transitioned into evening mode, most of the staff already gone, the hum of activity reduced to a distant background noise, and he sat with his hands resting on the edge of the desk, the file in front of him open but untouched, the numbers on the page no longer commanding his attention the way they always had, because his mind had settled somewhere else, somewhere less structured, less predictable. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the skyline beyond the window. The same view he had seen countless times, but now it felt different, not because the city had changed, but because the context through which he saw it had shifted, and he found himself replaying not the meeting, not the data, but the moments that had not been part of any agenda, the hallway, the conversation, the way she had stood without needing to defend or explain anything. And it unsettled him in a way that was not loud, not disruptive, but persistent, like a question that did not have a clear answer. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a second longer than necessary before opening a contact that had not been used in years. Her name still there, unchanged, a small detail that carried more weight than he expected, and he stared at it, not with hesitation, but with a recognition of what that simple action would represent. Not a business move, not a strategic decision, but something personal, something that did not fit into the framework he had built his life around. And after a moment, he lowered the phone back onto the desk without sending anything, the choice deliberate, not out of uncertainty, but out of an understanding that whatever existed between them now could not be approached the way everything else in his life was. Back in the quiet room, the tower of blocks had grown taller, each layer carefully placed, and the child leaned back slightly, studying it with a sense of accomplishment that did not need validation. "It is strong," he said, and Amara smiled, not broadly, not dramatically, but in a way that carried warmth without effort. "It is," she agreed, her voice soft, and he looked at her then, his expression open, curious in the way only a child's could be. "Did you build something today?" he asked, the question simple, unfiltered, and for a moment, she paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because the meaning behind it reached deeper than the words themselves. She glanced briefly toward the window, the night now settled outside, the reflection of the room faintly visible in the glass, and then back at him, her gaze steady. "Yes," she said, her tone calm, grounded. "I did." And he nodded as if that was enough, as if the answer did not require explanation. And he turned back to the tower, adjusting one of the blocks slightly, ensuring its balance remained intact. The moment lingered, not stretched, not forced, just present, and as she watched him, there was a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that everything she had built, every decision, every step, had led to this, not just the position she held, not just the authority she carried, but the life she had created beyond it, something that did not depend on recognition or validation from the world she had once tried to fit into. The room remained quiet, steady, and outside, the city continued to move, lights shifting, traffic flowing, lives intersecting in ways that did not always make sense. But inside, there was a balance that held, something built carefully, intentionally, layer by layer, just like the tower between them. And as the child placed the final block on top, stepping back with a small smile of satisfaction, Amara reached out, not to adjust it, not to change it, but simply to steady the base for a moment, ensuring that what had been built would hold. And in that small gesture, there was a reflection of everything she had done, not loud, not visible to everyone, but strong enough to stand on its own. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency, but with a steady light that filtered through the window in soft lines, touching the edges of the room where the tower of blocks still stood intact on the table, unchanged from the night before, and Amara Brooks paused in the doorway for a brief moment, taking in the stillness before stepping inside, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if she understood that the way a day began often shaped the way it unfolded, and she reached out, lightly brushing her fingers against the top of the structure, not to test it, but to acknowledge that it had held, that what had been built with care and attention had remained stable even in her absence. The child stirred at the table, his small hand shifting slightly as he leaned forward, eyes opening slowly, adjusting to the morning light with a softness that had not yet learned to guard itself. And when he saw her, the recognition was immediate, not questioned, not measured, just accepted. "It did not fall," he said, his voice still carrying traces of sleep, and she smiled faintly, a quiet affirmation rather than a reaction. "No, it did not," she replied, her tone even, grounded, and he sat up a little straighter, looking at the structure as if it had accomplished something beyond its size. something that mattered simply because it had lasted. The morning continued in small, steady motions. Breakfast prepared without rush, the sound of dishes placed gently on the counter, the low murmur of conversation that did not need to fill every silence. And as the day began to take shape, Amara moved through it with the same composure she carried into boardrooms. But here, it was not about control, it was about presence, about understanding that not everything needed to be managed to be meaningful. Later, as she stepped back into the rhythm of the city, the contrast returned, the pace quickening, the sounds layering into a familiar hum of movement and purpose. And when she entered the building again, the environment adjusted to her presence without needing acknowledgement. The receptionist's nod, the subtle shift in attention, the elevator arriving without delay, all of it part of a system that recognized patterns, recognized authority, recognized the quiet certainty she carried. The meeting that followed was structured, efficient, the continuation of decisions set in motion the day before, and Amara guided it with the same clarity, her voice steady, her analysis precise, her presence anchoring the room in a way that did not rely on volume or force. And across the table, Ethan Caldwell listened, not with resistance, not with dismissal, but with a focus that had changed. His attention no longer centered on maintaining control, but on understanding the direction she was establishing. And there were moments when he spoke, offering input, adjusting perspectives, but the dynamic remained clear, defined not by hierarchy alone, but by the shift that had already taken place between them. After the meeting, the room cleared again, the routine familiar, the movement predictable, but Ethan did not leave immediately. Instead, he remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the table where the documents had been, as if tracing the path of the conversation, not to challenge it, but to absorb it fully. And when he finally stood, his movements were measured, not rushed, not delayed, just aligned with a process he had not fully named yet. He stepped out into the hallway, the same corridor where their conversation had taken place, and for a moment, he paused, the memory of that exchange still present in the space, not as something that demanded attention, but as something that lingered, shaping the way he moved forward. And he walked toward the window at the end, the city stretching out beyond it, the same view, the same skyline, but now carrying a different context, a different weight. His phone vibrated again, a message from his team outlining next steps, timelines, expectations, and he read it. The information clear, actionable, but instead of responding immediately, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, the decision not driven by urgency, but by intention, because he understood now that not every response needed to be immediate to be effective. Across town, Amara's day unfolded with the same precision, meetings, calls, decisions layered into a structure that she navigated without strain, each element fitting into place because she had built the system herself, had shaped it to align with the way she thought, the way she worked, and there was no need to adjust herself to fit it, because it already reflected her. In the late afternoon, she stepped out of the building once more, the lights softer now, the air carrying the subtle shift toward evening. And as she walked along the sidewalk, her pace steady, her gaze forward, there was no sense of transition, no feeling of leaving one world to enter another, because the boundaries between them had been redefined, integrated into something cohesive, something that did not require separation to function. When she returned, the room was as she had left it, the tower still standing, unchanged, and the child looked up again, his expression brightening with the same immediate recognition. "You came back," he said, and she nodded, the simplicity of the statement matching the simplicity of her response. "I said I would," she replied, and he accepted that without question, without doubt, because for him, her presence was not something to analyze, it was something to trust. She sat beside him again, her movements easing into the rhythm of the space, and as he reached for another block, starting a new structure beside the first, she watched, not directing, not correcting, just observing the way he approached it, the way he learned through doing, through adjusting, through finding balance on his own terms. And for a moment, she allowed herself to see the parallel, the reflection of her own path in something so simple, so unspoken, and she reached out, steadying the base again, not because it was necessary, but because sometimes Even the strongest foundations benefit from a quiet hand that understands where to apply support without taking over. And in that small, deliberate gesture, there was a continuation of everything she had built, everything she had chosen, not defined by what had been left behind, but by what she continued to create, step by step, layer by layer, without needing to prove it to anyone but herself. The second structure did not rise as easily as the first, and as the child placed one block on top of another, it tilted slightly to the left, the imbalance small but noticeable, and he paused, his hand hovering midair as if trying to understand where the mistake had begun, and Amara Brooks watched without stepping in immediately, her gaze steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because she knew that not every instability needed to be corrected from the outside. Sometimes it needed to be recognized from within, and after a second, he adjusted the base, sliding one block a fraction of an inch until the line straightened, and only then did he place the next piece, his movements slower now, more intentional, and she nodded once, not to praise, but to acknowledge the process, the quiet correction that made the difference between collapse and balance. Across the city, the morning meeting had extended into something more complex than projected timelines and strategic alignment, and Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of a different table now, surrounded by his executive team, the room filled with voices that carried expectation and urgency. But he listened differently than before, not dismissing, not overriding, but allowing the conversation to settle before responding. And when he spoke, his tone remained controlled, but there was a shift in the way he framed his decisions. Less about immediate dominance, more about long-term stability, and it did not go unnoticed. The subtle recalibration in his approach, the way he paused before finalizing conclusions, the way he considered perspectives that he might have dismissed in the past, and although no one in the room addressed it directly, the change existed in the space between their words. Later, when the meeting ended and the room emptied, he remained seated again, his fingers resting lightly against the surface of the table, the same table where decisions had been made for years without hesitation, and he looked at it as if it had become something unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because his relationship to it had, and he exhaled slowly, standing up with measured movement before walking toward the window, the skyline stretching out beyond him in a pattern he knew by memory, but now it felt less like something he controlled and more like something he was part of, and that distinction settled into him with a weight he could not ignore. Back in the quieter part of the city, the second structure grew, not as tall as the first, but steadier in its foundation, and the child leaned back again, studying it with a different kind of satisfaction, one that came not from ease, but from correction, and he looked at Amara, his expression thoughtful. "This one is better," he said, and she tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "It is stronger," she replied, her voice calm, and he nodded, accepting that difference without needing further explanation, because he could feel it in the way the blocks held together, in the way the base no longer shifted when he touched it. The afternoon light filtered into the room, softer now, stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and Amara sat beside him, her presence steady, not guiding every step, but available when needed. And there was a balance in that, a rhythm that did not rely on control, but on understanding when to step in and when to step back. And as the child reached for another block, starting to extend the structure outward instead of upward, she watched the change in his approach, the way he explored new ways of building without being told to do so. And there was something familiar in that, something that echoed her own path, the shift from following a predetermined shape to creating something that fit her own design. Across town, Ethan's day continued, meetings stacking into one another, decisions flowing in a steady stream, but the undercurrent remained, the awareness that something fundamental had shifted, and as he moved through the routine, he found himself noticing details he had overlooked before, the way people responded to his tone, the way the room adjusted when he spoke, the subtle dynamics that existed beyond the surface of transactions, and it did not disrupt his efficiency, but it changed the way he perceived it, adding a layer that had not been part of his calculations before. In the late afternoon, he found himself standing once more in the corridor outside the conference room where he had seen her, the space quiet now, the glass walls reflecting an empty table inside, and he paused there, not out of indecision, but out of recognition, because that moment had not been isolated. It had carried forward into everything that followed, and he understood now that some encounters did not end when the conversation did. They continued in the way they reshaped perspective, in the way they altered what came next. Back in the room, the second structure stood complete, its base wider, its shape different, and the child smiled, a small, satisfied expression that did not seek approval, and Amara reached out, lightly pressing her fingers against the base once more, feeling the stability, the balance, the quiet strength of something built with awareness, and she nodded to herself, not as a gesture for him, but as a recognition of the pattern. The way growth often came not from building higher, but from building better. The evening settled again, the rhythm familiar now, and as the child gathered the blocks to start again, not because the structure had failed, but because he wanted to try something new, she watched. With the same steady attention, understanding that the process did not end with one success, it continued, evolving, adjusting, and outside, the city moved in its constant flow, unaware of the small, quiet moments that shaped lives in ways that could not be measured. And inside, in the space she had created, Amara Brooks remained grounded, not defined by what she had overcome, but by what she continued to build, one deliberate step at a time. The third structure began before the second one was even fully cleared, and the child's hands moved with a new kind of confidence, not rushing, not hesitating, but placing each block with a quiet awareness that had not been there at the beginning. And Amara Brooks watched from beside him, her presence steady, her attention focused not on the outcome, but on the process unfolding in front of her, because she understood that growth was not measured in how quickly something rose, but in how deeply it was understood. Outside, the evening deepened, the sky shifting from soft blue into darker shades that reflected against the window like a calm, endless surface, and inside, the room remained warm, grounded, insulated from the constant movement of the city beyond it, a space where time did not rush forward, but settled into itself. "This one will be different," the child said, his voice certain in a way that did not seek approval, and she glanced at him, her expression calm. "Then build it the way you see it," she replied, and he nodded, turning his attention back to the blocks, arranging them not in straight lines this time, but in a pattern that curved slightly, expanding outward before rising again. And she did not correct him, did not guide his hand. She simply observed, allowing him to explore the balance on his own terms. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood in his office with the lights dimmed, the skyline stretching out in a grid of illuminated windows that flickered like quiet signals across the night. And he had not left when the rest of the floor had emptied, not because he had more work to complete, but because he had not yet settled into what the day had become, and he moved away from the window slowly, his steps measured as he crossed the room, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of his desk, as if grounding himself in something familiar. He reached for a file, opening it without urgency, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency, but the information did not anchor him the way it normally did. It existed, clear, structured, but it did not hold his focus, and after a moment, he closed it again, the decision quiet, deliberate, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling through a breath that carried more weight than he intended. The memory of the hallway returned, not as a distraction, but as something that had embedded itself into his perception. The way she had stood without needing to claim space, the way she had spoken without needing to prove anything. And he realized that what unsettled him was not her position, not her authority, but her absence of need. The fact that she had stepped into that room without any attachment to him, without any trace of the past that he had assumed would remain between them. And that realization shifted something fundamental in the way he understood both her and himself. Back in the quiet room, the structure took shape in a way that did not follow the patterns of the first two. Its base wider, its lines curved, its center not aligned in the same way, and the child leaned back slightly, studying it with focused attention, adjusting one block, then another, refining the shape as he went. And Amara reached out once, not to change the design, but to steady a section that wavered slightly, her touch light, precise, just enough to support without altering the direction. And he glanced at her briefly, acknowledging the gesture before continuing, his confidence intact, his process uninterrupted. "It does not look the same," he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful, and she nodded, her gaze resting on the structure. "It does not have to," she replied, and he considered that, his eyes moving across the lines, the balance, the shape. And then he smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was his, and that was enough. Across town, Ethan's phone rested on his desk, the screen dark, but the presence of it carried a weight that had not been there before, and he picked it up again, his thumb moving across the surface with controlled precision before stopping at the same contact. Her name still there, unchanged, and this time, he did not hesitate as long, his fingers moving to type. Not a message filled with explanation, not an attempt to revisit what had been, but something simpler, something that aligned with the shift he had begun to recognize, and he paused before sending it, not out of doubt, but out of understanding that this action did not come with a guarantee, did not come with control, and after a moment, he lowered the phone again without pressing send, the decision settling into him as something necessary, because he understood now that not everything needed to be resolved through immediate action. Some things required space to exist as they were. The night deepened further, the city's rhythm softening into a quieter cadence, and inside the room, the third structure stood complete, not taller than the first, not stronger than the second, but different in a way that reflected the process that had created it, and the child placed his hand lightly against it, testing its stability, and when it held, he looked at Amara with a quiet satisfaction that did not need to be spoken, and she nodded once, her expression steady, her presence unchanged. She reached for the base again, her fingers pressing lightly against it, not because it needed correction, but because she understood the value of reinforcing what had already been built, and as she did, her gaze softened slightly, not with emotion that overwhelmed, but with recognition, the understanding that everything she had created, every step, every decision, had led to this balance, this quiet strength that did not need to be announced to exist. Outside, the city lights reflected against the glass, stretching into patterns that mirrored the structures inside, lines intersecting, paths crossing, each one part of something larger. And as the child began to gather the blocks again, preparing to start something new, Amara remained beside him, her presence steady, her focus grounded, not looking back, not measuring what had been, but fully present in what she continued to build, one deliberate moment at a time. The fourth structure did not begin with movement. It began with a pause, and the child sat still for a moment. The blocks gathered loosely in front of him, his hands resting on the table as if he was deciding something that could not be rushed, and Amara Brooks watched without interrupting, her presence steady beside him, her gaze calm, because she understood that sometimes the most important part of building was not the placement of pieces, but the decision of where to begin. And after a quiet moment, he reached forward, selecting a single block and placing it in the center, not at the edge, not at the corner, but exactly in the middle. And then he looked up at her, as if confirming something without asking, and she gave a small nod, not guiding, not correcting, just acknowledging that he had chosen his own starting point. Outside, the night had fully settled, the city lights forming a steady pattern that reflected against the glass, and in a high-rise office across town, Ethan Caldwell remained standing near his desk, the room dim except for the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the surface, and the silence there was different from the quiet in Amara's space. It was structured, controlled, but now it carried something else beneath it, something unresolved, something that did not fit neatly into the systems he had built around himself. And he picked up his phone again, the same contact open, her name still sitting there unchanged, and this time, his fingers moved with more certainty, typing a message slowly, deliberately, not filled with explanation, not layered with strategy, but simple, direct, and when he finished, he read it once. Not to edit, but to understand it, and then, without overthinking the outcome, he pressed send, the action quiet, but carrying a weight that shifted the stillness around him. Back in the room, the first block had been placed, and the child began building outward, not stacking upward immediately, but extending from the center in careful lines, forming a base that spread in multiple directions, and Amara leaned slightly closer, her attention focused, not to intervene, but to observe the pattern he was creating, and she saw the intention in it, the way he was thinking ahead, ensuring that what he built would have support from all sides. And she recognized that instinct, that shift from immediate results to long-term stability, and she allowed herself a quiet breath, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because growth did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appeared in small, deliberate choices like this. Her phone rested on the table beside her, silent, unmoving, until it vibrated once, a soft interruption that did not break the rhythm of the room, and she glanced at it briefly, her expression unchanged as she saw the notification, his name appearing in a space that had been empty for years, and for a moment, she did not reach for it, did not react. She simply acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged everything else, without urgency, without emotional shift, just awareness. And then she returned her attention to the child, to the structure forming in front of them, allowing the moment to remain grounded in what was present rather than what had arrived from outside. The base continued to expand, each block placed with care, the pattern becoming more defined, and the child's movements grew more confident, his hands steady, his focus clear, and he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "This one will not fall." And Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "Then it must be built to last," she said, her tone even, and he nodded, accepting that, his attention returning to the structure with renewed focus. Across town, Ethan stood still after sending the message, his phone resting in his hand, the screen dimming slowly as seconds passed without response, and he did not move to check it again immediately, did not pace or shift his position. He simply stood there, allowing the silence to exist, because he understood now that not everything required immediate feedback to hold meaning. And he placed the phone back on the desk, turning away from it as he walked toward the window, the city stretching out before him, vast and illuminated. And for the first time in a long while, he did not see it as something to be controlled, but as something to be navigated, something that did not adjust itself to his expectations, and that realization settled into him with a quiet clarity. Back in the room, the structure began to rise, not quickly, not in straight lines, but in layers that connected back to the base, each piece reinforcing the one before it. And Amara reached out once, her fingers steadying a section that shifted slightly, her touch light, precise, and the child glanced at her, acknowledging the support before continuing, his confidence intact, his process uninterrupted. And when the structure reached a certain height, he leaned back, studying it, not rushing to add more, but evaluating what was already there, and she watched him, her gaze steady, recognizing the discipline in that pause, the understanding that building was not just about adding, but about knowing when to stop. Her phone vibrated again, the second notification arriving, and this time, she picked it up, her movements calm, her expression unchanged as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the words once, not lingering, not searching for hidden meaning, just reading. And the message was simple, direct, without embellishment, a reflection of the shift she had already observed, and she held the phone for a moment longer before setting it back down, her decision not immediate, not reactive, but intentional, because she understood that responding was not about timing, it was about alignment. The structure stood complete, not towering, not perfect, but stable in a way that reflected the care that had gone into it, and the child smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling into his expression, and Amara reached out, her hand resting lightly at the base once more, feeling the strength of it, the balance, the quiet certainty that it would hold, and she nodded to herself, not because it needed approval, but because it represented something understood, something built with intention. And outside, the city continued its steady movement, unaware of the small decisions being made inside, the quiet shifts that carried more weight than any visible change. And as the child began to gather the blocks again, preparing to build something new, Amara Brooks remained grounded in the moment, her presence steady, her path clear, not defined by the message waiting on her phone, but by the life she had already built, one deliberate choice at a time. The message did not change the room. It did not alter the quiet rhythm of the night or the steady presence of the child beside her, but it existed now, sitting on the table like a new piece that had not yet been placed. And Amara Brooks glanced at her phone once more, not out of urgency, but out of clarity, the words still simple, still direct, still carrying a weight that did not need explanation. and she picked it up slowly, her movements measured, her expression unchanged as she read it. Again, not searching for something hidden, but confirming what was already clear, and then she set it down once more, her attention returning to the space in front of her, because she understood that not every message required an immediate answer. Some required alignment, and alignment could not be rushed. The child had already begun another structure, his hands moving with quiet confidence. The blocks arranged in a new pattern that reflected everything he had learned so far, and she watched him for a moment. The way he adjusted the base before building upward, the way he paused to evaluate before placing the next piece, and she nodded slightly, not to direct him, but to acknowledge the growth that had taken place without needing to be announced. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood by his window again, the skyline stretching out beneath him in steady lines of light, and his phone remained on the desk behind him, the message sent. The silence that followed no longer something he could control, and he did not turn back to check it immediately, did not reach for it out of habit. Instead, he allowed the space to exist, the uncertainty, the absence of response, because he understood now that not everything could be resolved through action. Some things required patience, and patience was not something he had often practiced. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding him as he looked out at the city he had once viewed as something to master, something to shape according to his vision. And now it felt different, not smaller, not larger, but more complex, more independent, and that shift settled into him in a way that could not be undone. Back in the room, the structure grew, not taller than the others, but more refined, its base strong, its lines balanced, and the child leaned back slightly, studying it with a quiet focus that had replaced the earlier uncertainty, and he looked at Amara again, his expression thoughtful. "This one feels right," he said, and she tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "Then it is built the way it should be," she replied, her voice calm, and he nodded, accepting that, his confidence steady, his process complete. The room remained quiet, the night settled fully outside, and Amara reached for her phone again, her movements deliberate, not reactive, and she opened the message once more, her eyes moving across the words with the same clarity, the same absence of emotional pull, because she was not reading it as a return to something, but as a new point of interaction, something that existed separate from the past, and her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, not hesitating, but aligning, ensuring that whatever she chose to say would reflect who she was now, not who she had been. Across town, Ethan remained still, the minutes passing without interruption, and he did not measure them, did not calculate the delay. He simply allowed them to exist, because he understood that whatever response came, if it came, would not follow the patterns he was used to, and that understanding required him to step outside the framework he had built for himself, to exist in a space where outcomes were not guaranteed, where control was not absolute, and that space felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Amara began to type, her movements calm, her thoughts clear, the message forming. Without excess, without explanation, without reaching backward into what had been. And when she finished, she read it once, not to adjust, but to confirm that it aligned with her, with the person she had become, and then she pressed send, the action quiet, the impact not immediate, but certain, and she set the phone down again, her attention returning to the room, to the child, to the structure that stood in front of them. The phone vibrated almost instantly on Ethan's desk, the response arriving with a simplicity that mirrored the message he had sent, and he turned slowly, walking back toward it with measured steps, not rushing, not delaying. And when he picked it up, his eyes moved across the screen, reading her words once, then again, not because they were complex, but because they were clear, direct, and carried a boundary that did not need to be stated twice. And he exhaled softly, the breath steady, the understanding settling into him without resistance. The room around him remained unchanged, the desk, the files, the city beyond the window, but his position within it had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that affected everything that followed, and he placed the phone back down, his hand resting on the surface for a moment longer before stepping away, not because he was finished, but because he understood that this was not something to be resolved in a single exchange. It was something that would unfold over time, in actions, in choices, in the way he moved forward. Back in the quiet room, the child reached out, lightly touching the structure one last time before beginning to gather the blocks again. His movements steady, his confidence intact, and Amara watched him, her presence unchanged, her focus grounded, and she did not think about the message anymore, did not revisit the exchange, because it had already been placed, already aligned with who she was now, and her path did not depend on it, did not shift because of it. It continued as it always had, built on decisions that reflected her own direction, her own understanding. And as she reached out once more to steady the base of the structure before it was taken apart, her touch light, precise, she carried the same quiet certainty, the same balance, knowing that whatever came next would be built the same way, with intention, with clarity, and without needing to look back. The morning did not rush in. It unfolded slowly, the light stretching across the room in soft layers that revealed what remained from the night before. The table now cleared, the blocks gathered into a quiet pile, waiting to be used again, and Amara Brooks stood by the window for a moment longer than usual, her hand resting lightly against the glass as she looked out at the city, not searching, not reflecting, simply present in the space between what had been and what was about to begin. And there was a stillness in her posture, not hesitation, but alignment, as if every part of her had settled into the same direction without needing to be guided. Behind her, the child moved slowly into the room, his steps soft against the floor, his eyes adjusting to the light as he reached the table and looked at the blocks, not rushing to rebuild, not repeating what he had done before, but standing there for a moment, considering. And she turned slightly, watching him without interrupting, recognizing the same pause, the same awareness that had begun to shape the way he approached everything. And after a second, he looked up at her. "Can I try something new today?" he asked, his voice steady, and she nodded, her expression calm. "You always can," she replied, her tone even, and he smiled, not wide, not loud, just enough to carry certainty, and he reached for the blocks, beginning again, not with a pattern, but with intention. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell arrived earlier than usual, the building still quiet, the lobby not yet filled with movement, and as he stepped inside, there was a different awareness in the way he moved, not slower, not uncertain, but more deliberate, as if he was no longer simply entering a space he controlled, but stepping into one he was now actively aware of, and the elevator carried him upward in the same silent rhythm, the numbers climbing steadily. But the distance felt different, not because the building had changed, but because his perception of it had, and when the doors opened, he stepped out into the corridor with the same composed presence. But something beneath it had shifted, something that no longer aligned with the version of him that had once walked through these spaces without question. The day began with meetings, discussions, decisions that followed the structure he had built over years, but his engagement with them had changed, not in efficiency, not in clarity, but in depth, in the way he listened, in the way he considered, in the way he allowed space before responding, and it did not slow the process, it refined it, adding a layer that had not been present before, and those around him noticed, not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts, the way conversations extended, slightly longer, the way input was received differently, the way the room adjusted to a presence that no longer pushed as hard, but held more weight. Back in the quiet room, the new structure began to take shape, not centered, not symmetrical, but intentional in its imbalance, and the child placed the first few blocks with care, testing how they held when positioned differently, exploring what happened when the pattern changed. And Amara sat beside him, her presence steady, her gaze focused, not directing, not correcting, just observing the process unfold. And when one piece tilted slightly, she did not reach out immediately, allowing him the space to recognize it. And he did, adjusting it with a small movement that restored the balance. And she nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the awareness that had grown. Her phone rested nearby, silent now after the exchange from the night before, and she did not reach for it, did not revisit the message, because it had already been placed where it needed to be, and her focus remained where it belonged, on what she was building, on what she was shaping, on the life that continued forward without needing to be anchored to anything behind it. Across town, Ethan stood in his office again, the morning light now replacing the night's reflections, and he glanced at his phone briefly, not searching for another message, not expecting one, just acknowledging its presence before setting it aside. And he moved toward the window, the city, now active, alive with movement. And he watched it with a different understanding, not as something to command, but as something to move within, something that did not adjust itself to his decisions, but responded to them in ways that required awareness rather than control. The realization settled into him slowly, not as a sudden shift, but as a steady adjustment, and he turned back toward his desk, his movements measured, his focus clear, not on what had been said, but on what would follow, on how he would move forward in a way that reflected this new understanding. And he reached for a file, opening it with the same precision, but reading it with a perspective that had changed, not altering the data, but altering the way he engaged with it. Back in the room, the structure grew, its lines forming a pattern that did not mirror anything from before, and the child leaned back, studying it, his expression thoughtful. "It is different," he said, and Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Different does not mean wrong," she replied, her voice calm, and he nodded, accepting that, his confidence steady, and he reached forward, adding another piece, not to correct, but to continue, to build on what was already there. The morning moved forward, the rhythm of the day settling into place, and Amara remained grounded in it, her presence unchanged, her focus clear, and as she watched the structure take shape, she recognized something deeper, something that extended beyond the simple act of building, the understanding that growth was not about repeating what worked, but about evolving, about allowing space for new patterns to form, even when they did not align with what had come before. And she reached out once more, steadying the base with a light touch, not because it was unstable, but because she understood the value of reinforcement, of quiet support that did not interfere with direction. And as the structure stood, balanced in its difference, she allowed herself a small breath, not of relief, not of completion, but of recognition, because everything she had built, everything she had become, existed in the same way, not perfect, not identical to what had been expected, but strong, intentional, and entirely her own. The structure did not collapse, but it did not stand untouched either. And as the child placed another block onto the uneven edge, the balance shifted just enough to make the entire form lean slightly to one side, not enough to fall, but enough to reveal where the weight had not been evenly distributed. And he froze for a moment, his hands still hovering in the air, his eyes fixed on the subtle tilt as if trying to understand whether it was a mistake or simply a different way of standing. And Amara Brooks watched quietly beside him, her posture steady, her gaze focused not on the flaw itself, but on his reaction to it, because she understood that what happened next mattered more than the imbalance itself. "It is not straight," he said finally, his voice thoughtful rather than frustrated, and she nodded once, her expression calm. "No, it is not," she replied, not correcting him, not softening the truth, just acknowledging what was there. And he leaned closer, his small fingers adjusting one block slightly, then another, testing the structure, feeling how it responded, and for a second, it seemed like it might fall, the tension visible in the slight tremor of the upper pieces, but then it settled again, not perfect, not symmetrical, but stable enough to hold, and he exhaled softly, not in relief, but in understanding. "It can stay like this," he said, and Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "If it holds, then it works," she said, her voice even, and he nodded, accepting that, his confidence not shaken, but refined. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell sat in a conference room filled with quiet voices and measured tension, the discussion unfolding around projections, risks, and outcomes that required precise alignment. But his attention was not fragmented, not distracted, it was deeper, more focused. And when he spoke, his tone carried a different weight, not because it was louder, but because it was more considered, more deliberate, and the shift in his presence influenced the room in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Conversations paused slightly longer, responses carried more thought, and decisions formed with a level of clarity that extended beyond immediate gain. And as he leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the table, he listened fully before responding, allowing space where he once would have filled it, And in that space, something changed, not the outcome, but the way it was reached. Later, when the meeting ended and the room cleared, he remained seated for a moment, his gaze resting on the table, not seeing the documents, but processing something less tangible, something that had carried through every interaction since he had seen her again. And he exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling as he leaned back slightly, the weight of realization not heavy, but steady. And he understood now that what he had lost was not something that could be regained through action alone. It required a shift in how he moved forward, in how he approached what mattered. And that understanding did not bring regret in the way he might have expected. It brought clarity, a recognition of what had been missing, and what could still be built differently. Back in the quiet room, the structure remained as it was, slightly tilted, but standing. And the child sat back, studying it with a new kind of awareness, not measuring it against perfection, but understanding it in terms of balance, of function. And he reached out once more, adjusting a single piece, not to correct the entire form, but to support the part that carried the most weight. And Amara watched, her gaze steady, recognizing the instinct, the ability to strengthen without dismantling. And she reached out as well, her hands steadying the base with a light, precise touch, not because it needed correction, but because reinforcement mattered even. When something appeared stable, her phone rested nearby, silent, the exchange from before no longer active, no longer waiting, and she did not reach for it, did not revisit it, because it had already been placed in the right context, and her focus remained on what was in front of her, on what she was building, on what continued to grow without needing to be anchored to anything outside of it. Across town, Ethan stood once more by the window, the afternoon light shifting into early evening, the city moving in steady patterns below, and he watched it with a clarity that had not been there before, not as something to control, but as something to understand, something that existed beyond his influence. And that understanding did not diminish his position, it refined it, grounding it in a way that felt more stable, more aligned. And he turned away from the glass, his movements measured as he walked back toward his desk, not with urgency, but with intention. And he reached for his phone, not to check for a response, not to initiate another message, but simply to hold it for a moment, acknowledging the connection that had been re-established, not as a return, but as a new point of reference. Back in the room, the structure held, its slight tilt no longer a flaw, but a characteristic, something that defined it rather than weakened it. And the child smiled softly, his understanding settled, and Amara nodded once, her presence unchanged, her awareness grounded. And she did not adjust the tilt, did not correct it, because she understood that not everything needed to be straight to be strong, not everything needed to match an expectation to be valid. And as the evening light filtered into the room, casting long, quiet shadows across the table, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, not to reflect, not to question, but to recognize, because everything she had built, everything she had become, carried the same truth, that strength was not always in perfection. It was in balance, in resilience, in the ability to hold even when the lines were not exactly as expected. And as the child reached for another block, beginning again without needing to erase what had already been created, she remained beside him, steady, present, aligned with the quiet certainty that whatever came next would be built with the same intention, the same clarity, and the same understanding that had carried her this far. The structure remained standing, not perfect, not symmetrical, but grounded in a balance that had been earned rather than forced. And the child sat quietly in front of it, his hands resting on the table as he studied what he had built, not with the urgency to change it, not with the need to improve it immediately, but with a calm understanding that it was enough as it was. And Amara Brooks sat beside him, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, the soft evening light settling around them in a quiet glow that did not demand attention but held it gently. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because there was nothing that needed to be done, nothing that needed to be fixed, only something to be recognized. "It is not the same as before," he said, his voice thoughtful, and she turned slightly toward him, her expression calm. "No, it is not," she replied, and he nodded slowly, his eyes still on the structure. "But I like this one more," he added, and she allowed a small breath to settle in her chest. Not relief, not surprise, just recognition. Because that understanding did not come from instruction, it came from experience, from the quiet process of building and adjusting and learning what held and what did not. And she reached out, her fingers resting lightly against the base once more, not to correct, not to guide, but to acknowledge the strength that had been created without needing to be perfect. Outside, the city moved through its evening rhythm, lights shifting, cars passing, windows reflecting fragments of lives that continued without pause. And across town, Ethan Caldwell stood once more by his window, the skyline stretching out in front of him in the same pattern it had always been, but now it carried a different weight, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, and he held his phone in his hand, not waiting, not expecting, but aware of the connection that now existed, not as something that needed to be resolved, but as something that had already been defined by the choices they had both made. And he looked down at the screen one last time before placing it on the desk, his hand lingering there for a second longer than necessary, as if acknowledging that what had been set in motion could not be undone, only understood. He turned away from the window then, his movements steady, his posture composed, but there was a difference in the way he carried himself, not visible in the sharp lines of his suit or the precision of his steps, but in the quiet space between them, in the way he no longer moved with the same rigid certainty, but with a measured awareness that allowed room for what he could not control. And as he walked out of his office, the hallway lights casting a soft reflection along the glass walls, he did not look back, not because there was nothing behind him, but because he understood that moving forward required him to step fully into what lay ahead. Back in the quiet room, the child reached out and gently removed one of the blocks from the structure, not to dismantle it, but to begin again, his movements careful, his expression calm. And Amara watched him, her presence unchanged, her understanding deepened, because she knew that growth was not about preserving what had been built forever. It was about knowing when to let go, when to rebuild, when to create something new without losing the foundation of what had been learned. And as the structure shifted slightly with the removal of the block, it did not collapse, it adjusted, holding its shape in a new way. And he smiled softly, recognizing that change did not always mean loss. Sometimes it meant adaptation. "I can make another one," he said, his voice steady, and she nodded, her gaze warm but grounded. "You always can," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that carried more strength than any assurance spoken louder. And he began again, selecting blocks with the same intention, placing them with the same care, his movements guided not by instruction, but by understanding. The room remained calm, the evening settling into night, and Amara leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze shifting briefly toward the window where the faint reflection of the room met the darkness outside. And for a moment, she saw both at once, the life she had built and the world beyond it, not separate, not conflicting, but existing together in a balance that did not require her to choose between them. And she allowed herself a quiet breath, not to release tension, but to acknowledge that everything she had worked toward, everything she had become, existed here, in this moment, not in the past, not in the expectations of others, but in the quiet certainty of her own direction. Across the city, Ethan stepped out into the night, the air cool, the sound of the city softer now. And as he walked toward the street, his steps measured, his gaze forward, he did not carry the same weight he once had, not because it had been lifted, but because it had been understood. And he paused briefly before entering his car, his eyes lifting once more to the skyline, the light steady, the structure of it unchanged, but his place within it different. And he understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by what he had lost, but by how he chose to move forward. And that choice, unlike before, would not be made from certainty alone, but from awareness. Back in the room, the new structure began to rise again, different from the last, different from all the ones before, and Amara Brooks remained beside it, not directing, not correcting, just present, her hand steady at the base when needed, her presence a quiet constant that did not demand attention but provided it. And as the child placed another block, his movements confident, his focus clear, she allowed herself a small, unspoken acknowledgement, not of what had been overcome, but of what continued to be built, because the truth of it did not need to be declared, It existed in every deliberate step, every quiet decision, every moment that moved forward without looking back. And as the structure stood once more, balanced in its own way, she did not reach to change it, did not adjust its lines. She simply let it be, knowing that strength was not in perfection, but in the ability to stand, to hold, to exist fully as it was. And with that understanding, she remained where she was, grounded, steady, and entirely her own.